Welcome to the podcast.
Woo!
I on
Yippee!
Physiology podcast. We're going to go over some complicated topics of circulation physiology today. Good thing that everybody struggles with but loves in the end.
There we go.
You
Yeah.
tell them, Haley.
Yes. Well, good morning to everyone. I think first up we have Nadeem. He's going to be talking about flow and cross-sectional area.
All right. So I hope everyone's doing well today. Let's start with the flow. Flow is basically cardiac output, which is the amount of volume of blood that passes by a single point um, within the circulatory system. And very easy to understand, like an easier way to understand the flow. The flow is basically it is velocity of the blood and done by the cross-sectional area. So how much blood is passing through a cross-sectional area. Um, when blood is passing through the big arteries or the big veins, it's actually passing through a smaller cross-sectional area if you count the whole thing. So basically, if you take one artery, it's going to branch into a lot of little arterioles and then capillaries. And these, at the end, are actually collected together to give a larger cross-sectional area. Um, and so, because it's a larger cross-sectional area, the flow of blood will reduce during those capillaries, like when it passes through the capillaries. And it is very important because that will allow more time for nutritional exchange. Um, And again, then those capillaries will go into becoming venules, and then those venules will actually go into become like the vena cava and go back to the right atrium. Um, it's it, it's a very like if you think about it, it makes sense. Slow down the volume, slow down, sorry, the speed of blood flow during those like the parts of the body where an exchange of nutrients happens, an exchange of gas happens. And something else that is very important to understand is that the systemic venules and veins are called volume reservoir because normally they have between 65 to 60% of blood volume in them all the time. So this is very important, like to understand is that's why they're called um, volume reservoir. The arterioles, on the other hand, are called pressure reservoirs. Sorry, the arteries are called pressure reservoirs because they're not very they're not very compliant. Okay, and so not a lot of the blood in the body is actually stored in them at the time, and that's really it for flow. I mean, just remember that flow equals velocity times the CSA area, and then that's something very easy to remember, and hopefully you'll like pass through this immediately. I'm done. I have no idea what I just said, but go ahead.
Thought it was awesome, Nadeem. Truly, truly inspirational.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great
yeah.
job, great job. You almost sounded a little
Whatever,
depressed the whole time. It's okay.
whatever.
So who's next after cross
Yeah,
section? Is that you,
what do we,
Haley?
is it me?
I think it was series in parallel.
All right. Well, thanks for that nice intro on flow, Nadeem. Yeah, I'm gonna be diving deeper into different ways that we can calculate the resistance of vessels, and we can do that in a series flow or a parallel flow. So starting with the little easier one is the series flow. I know if you're looking at these in your modules, you're probably like a little intimidated. I know I was when I was looking at them, but it's pretty easy. So when we say a series flow, all that is two or more vessels with different resistances that are connected end to end. So for example, let's say we've got a small capillary and then that leads into a slightly bigger venule and then a big vein. We can calculate the resistance of the blood flow through that tube, or total resistance. And the way you're going to do that is you're literally just going to add up the resistances of each part of the series. Um, so I'm not drawing it out for a podcast, but let's say, you've got your biggest resistance in the capillary because it's the smallest. You got a resistance of 5. In the venule, you have a resistance of about 3. In the vein, it's like 2. You can add all those up, you're going to get a total resistance of 10. And that's really it. So your total resistance in a series is always going to be greater than your largest initial resistance. And that's how you know you've done the math right. And then you can calculate like what percent of one of the resistances is, like how it's contributing to the total resistance. So like remember our resistance of the capillary was 5. You can do 5 over 10. 50% of your resistance is coming from that capillary out of the whole series. So just remember series flow, sum up all the resistances that it gives you, and you can find your total resistance. Pretty simple. We get a little bit more complicated with parallel flow. So when we're talking about parallel flow, um, that's going to be more like you have a capillary that branches off and you got one going up here and one going down here. The blood's flowing parallel and then it's going to come back at the end, if you can picture that. Um, and all you're going to do to calculate that parallel flow is you're going to find the inverses of the resistances and add all of those together. So just like in series flow, you're going to be given a few resistances, R1 is 5, R2 is 2, whatever. When you're adding those up, you just add up the inverses. So instead of 5 plus 2, it'll be 1 over 5 plus 1 over 2. And to do that math, you got to find your least common denominator and all that fun stuff. Trauma, going back to math. But they're all pretty simple calculations, so you can do that. And then at the end, you'll end up with 1 over your total resistance is equal to some fraction. Flip them both, you'll have your total resistance of the parallel flow. And your parallel flow is always going to be less than the largest resistance. So you get pretty small numbers for those, but I always remembered it. Series, you're just adding. Parallel, you're adding the inverses because parallel is more complicated than series and inverses are more complicated than adding. And that's pretty much it. We go through
Yeah.
plenty of those examples in the modules. Make sure you watch those little videos in there and do your practice questions, and you'll be good to go on those.
I just wanted to highlight really quick, just to sort of summarize like what Nadim and Haley have talked about with regards to cross-sectional area and flow. Like we know cross-sectional area increases, which is what Haley's describing with these parallel flows. And when we think about like our body physiologically, it's really important that we have low resistances so that everything is perfused within our bodies. And so, our bodies are, our vessels are, branching into many, many different, arterioles and capillaries to perfuse all of these things. And our resistances, cross-sectional area is increased to allow for like total perfusion throughout our whole body. And so they're just talking about the sort of math behind that concept. And so
Fantastic point. Yeah. Thanks for adding
Go
that.
do the good. Yeah, like everybody should do the practice questions. More sense actually. Yeah.
and so now I think Caleb's going to be talking about Reynolds number and laminar and turbulent flow.
Yes, I am. What a great introduction. I was just gonna show like the actual equation behind it. Get that out of there. So can you all see my screen? All right, so these are just things that I pulled directly from your all's module. You could see that RE, that's what we're calling Reynolds number. It's going to be the inertia forces over the viscous forces. So inertia, that driving force of the actual fluid. Viscous forces, when we talk about viscosity, it's almost like the thickness of the liquid. So when you're thinking of like honey, right? That's a very viscous substance, whereas water is not very viscous. Same thing for like slime. Like if you ever like had like the little cups of slime like in elementary school or whatever, that's like a viscous substance. So inertia forces are going to be the driving factors behind the actual fluid. So we're gonna have like the actual velocity of the fluid, the hold on, let me draw that out there. The velocity, the diameter, we have like the actual composition of the fluid itself. How many like actual molecules are present within the substance. And so when we're talking about this, all of these come together to actually equate to Reynolds number, which is going to be a value given, which kind of helps evaluate whether or not you're receiving turbulent flow or laminar flow. If you've ever turned on like the faucet in your bathroom or whatever, and you've seen like the water coming out, and it almost looks like a solid, it looks like a glass figure. You can't really detect like movement with your eye. It's very smooth. That's the laminar flow. You can see here that we actually see a steady stream almost. It's called parabolic flow because you could see a parabola forming right there where like the center is coming out more and then the edges are following with it. That parabolic flow is leading to a smooth flow of blood through the vessel. That's going to be when you have Reynolds number less than 2000. Then you have a transitional portion where it's like not quite fully laminar flow, not quite fully turbulent flow. Once it reaches above 2300, that's where we see what we call turbulent flow, which is going to be chaotic, like the blood bashing against the sides of the walls. You can see here that as the red blood cells are flowing through, you see it scraping and hitting different areas throughout the vessel wall. That can lead to where we have like blood clots. That turbulent flow is able to kind of peel back that endothelial wall and expose clots and allow breakage of that wall. So turbulent flow leads towards different clinical conditions that are caused by vessel wall tearing, blood clot formation, and like breaking off by turbulent flow. Turbulent flow is kind of like I turned a blender on inside of your blood vessels and it's bashing against the wall over and over. So that's why we talk about it being a bad thing. Obviously, nobody wants their blood to be all running willy-nilly throughout your actual blood vessels. That would lead to bad complications. So Reynolds number is how we calculate that and what we use to define actual turbulent flow versus laminar flow. And so, like in quizzes or modules, or quizzes or exams, will give you these numbers, and it's kind of up to you to kind of just plug and play with the values and find Reynolds number and determine, okay, is it above 2300 or is it below 2000? Is it laminar, turbulent? Is it in that transitional state? And that's all I got on turbulent flow and Reynolds number.
I think now we've got a word from our sponsors.
Yep, we always got the good sponsors for this podcast. Today, thankfully, we're sponsored by the Venous Return Rewards Program. It's the only loyalty program where everyone eventually comes back. Yeah,
Thank you very
thank
much,
you.
Haley.
We love
Thank you.
that.
And that leads us into the next thing we're talking about, which is the venous return and cardiac function curves. So this is a topic that is it seems a little daunting at first when you're looking at the graphs. I know from your all's perspective, we've all been in that position, uh, all six of us, where it can be a little overwhelming, but we're going to try and simplify it for you. So, talking about it generically, like the heart can only pump out what the veins deliver. And so this venous return overlaid with a cardiac function curve is just representing that balance point between venous return and cardiac output and seeing where everything sits. So when we look at our venous return curve, on the x-axis, we have right atrial pressure. So this is the pressure that the veins have to like push against in order to return blood to the right atrium. And on the y-axis, we have venous return, which is the flow of blood returning to the right atrium. So when we look at it, we have a downward sloping curve. And so that is because as right atrial pressure increases, the pressure gradient driving blood back to the heart decreases. So as the right atrium is filling with blood, venous return starts to slow down. And so we've described this venous return as mean circulatory filling pressure minus right atrial pressure over the resistance to venous return. So mean circulatory filling pressure is just a fancy way. It's the average pressure throughout the circulation if the heart stopped. So when we all die, our when our blood equilibrates, mean circulatory filling pressure, it's about 7 millimeters of mercury, I think, where everything sets to. And so the slope of the curve of the venous return curve is also dependent upon venous resistance. And so the x-axis can tell you what mean circulatory filling pressure is. And so regarding mean circulatory filling pressure, if we're increasing blood volume or we tighten the veins with sympathetic stimulation, the mean circulatory filling pressure is going to rise and we'll have an increase in venous return, which will shift our curve up and to the right. So more blood is flowing back to the heart. And so that is the basis for the venous return curve. If we talk about the Frank-Starling curve, we've talked about this a lot from cardiac physiology. And so we know Frank-Starling is based upon the length tension relationship and the preload and filling of the heart. And so this can tell us what our cardiac function is. And so as right atrial pressure increases, end diastolic volume is going to be increasing. And so there's more stretch and increases the volume for cardiac output. So if we overlay these curves, the point where they intersect is going to give us a balancing point between venous return and cardiac output. And so that demonstrates that sort of steady state equilibrium. We've talked about that term back in body fluids, but this is where it sort of comes into play, where we have the same amount of blood coming back to the heart, the same amount of blood leaving. And so that is really what the overlay is telling you with the venous return and cardiac function curves. And being able to really understand how the venous return and cardiac function curve will change with certain scenarios. Like if we have increased contractility, for example, our Frank-Starling curve is going to shift up and to the left because we have, greater contraction and greater ejection of blood. And so we'll have a higher cardiac output and a lower right atrial pressure. So then venous return is also increased because of our increased cardiac output to sort of balance that out. And so that's mainly it's a little overwhelming. I think that sitting with it for a minute and just trying to simplify what the graphs are a little busy, but if you break them down individually and try and put them together, it's all just trying to tell you how this closed system is returning blood to the heart and ejecting blood. So that's about it.
I feel like you just cleared that up for me from back when I
That
was a
was
student. That
very,
was
very
really,
wordy,
that was
but
good.
it's basically blood returning to the heart is equal to blood leaving the heart. And that's just what the intersection point is trying to get you to understand.
All right, I think it's my turn now. So I'm going to be talking about systolic versus diastolic pressure. And we were introduced to this in cardiophysiology, but systolic pressure is the peak pressure in the arteries that occurs when the heart squeezes or contracts and forces blood out into the large arteries. And it's influenced mainly by how much blood the heart ejects with each beat and how forcefully it contracts. So, for example, a stronger heartbeat with a larger stroke volume or stiffer arteries will all increase systolic pressure, whereas diastolic pressure is the lowest pressure in the arteries, and it's measured whenever the heart is relaxed and refilling with blood. And it depends mostly on how tightly the small arteries and arterioles are constricted and how fast the heart is beating. So, for example, if arteries are vasoconstricted or the heart rate speeds up, diastolic pressure will rise because the blood stays trapped in the arterial system for longer. And then, like Nadeem mentioned, arteries and arterioles are pressure reservoirs, whereas venules and veins are volume reservoirs. So by the time the blood reaches the veins, the pulse has been completely smoothed out by the resistance of the tiny arterioles, leaving the venous system with only a low, steady pressure system instead of the rhythmic high and low that we see with the arteries and arterioles. This is why veins don't have systolic and diastolic pressure. So then just to summarize, systolic pressure is that high pressure wave we see when the heart is contracting, and this is influenced by increased stroke volume, increased contractility, and increased arterial stiffness. And then diastolic pressure is that low pressure wave we see when the heart is relaxed. And this is increased with increased vasoconstriction, increased heart rate. So that's pretty much a summary of systolic versus diastolic pressure.
Okay, so I guess from there, we covered a lot of different parts about circulation. And so moving from that, we're going to talk about mean arterial pressure, which is basically just the final totally integrated output for our cardiovascular control system and the circulation of the body. And there are a lot of different things that go into it and that help control our mean arterial pressure. The main two components of it, we have our systemic vascular resistance and then our cardiac output. So for the SVR, that's the systemic vascular resistance, that is largely going to be controlled by the radius of our arterial, the arterial radius. And that's where we see like Poiseuille's law coming into play, one of those useless physics equations that we thought we'd never have to use again. But where we can actually see that the resistance of those blood vessels can change to a huge degree of magnitude based on just a very small change in the radius because it's an inverse relationship to the fourth power. So I think Dr. Brandon loves to say it is a order of magnitude change with the radius to resistance. And so we see that when the vasoconstrictor tone is increasing, we're going to have that vascular resistance rise as well. And so then when the vasoconstrictors are decreasing, then our resistance is going to decrease as well. Going over to cardiac output, it's the second main determinant for the mean arterial pressure. Essentially, it's just your heart rate times your stroke volume. So it's just how much blood is your heart able to pump out over a minute. And these are going to be the main two things that are kind of determining our mean arterial pressure. There are other determinants that go into it basing on like the cardiac output based on changes to either the heart rate or the stroke volume. So if we look at like the heart rate, it has a dual autonomic control. So either parasympathetic or sympathetic activity can affect your heart rate, either slowing it down or speeding it up, which would then affect your cardiac output. Because if we have a slower heart rate, we would have a reduced cardiac output. And if we have a higher heart rate, we would increase that cardiac output. Same thing with the stroke volume. So the stroke volume, it's the difference between our end diastolic and end systolic volume. And so anything in there that would increase our end diastolic or decrease our end systolic would actually increase our stroke volume. So anything that is increasing the volume of blood in the heart when it is done filling, or anything that is decreasing the blood getting pushed out. Then we can also go back from there to talk about contractility, which is basically just the force of contraction and the contraction in the heart. We can talk about venous return. It's really essential for the end diastolic volume, getting controlled by the venous tone with sympathetic output. And increased sympathetic activity is going to tighten the musculature around the uh, veins of vasculature to reduce that compliance and keep pushing that blood back to the heart. Um, Going over to blood volume, uh, if we have less blood in our body, it's going to um, go forward and reduce our arterial pressure just because there is simply less fluid filling up that space. Um, and then from there, we're getting back into sympathetic and parasympathetic controls and the baroreceptors, which I don't believe have been covered yet. That's about all I have. It's a lot at once.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you. Do we have any more sponsors this week, Haley?
We've always got sponsors. People
We've
love
always got
us.
sponsors.
They love to sponsor us. Let's see. I think today was also sponsored by Stroke Volume Supplements. Those
Mm,
increase your output the natural way.
very nice. Very nice. All right. Well, I think that does it for us today in talking about circulation. Haley, Caleb, and I will be hosting a town hall tonight talking about circulation further, looking at practice questions. So please join us for that. Otherwise, if you'll have any questions, please feel free to reach out in the discussion post to send us your questions. It's anonymous. Whatever you all want us to talk about, we will. Um, and I'll fill in for Dr. Brainerd. Stay cool, stay cool, stay in school, don't do drugs. Catch you on the next one. Am I missing anything?
Perfect.
All right, there we go.
That was perfect.
Thank you guys.